Tanya Rodriguez had exactly 17 minutes to catch the 6:42 a.m. subway to her cleaning job downtown. But when she saw the well-dressed woman standing frozen at the station map with tears threatening to spill from her eyes, those 17 minutes suddenly didn't matter anymore. This stranger clutched a crumpled piece of paper and looked completely lost in a city that could swallow people whole. Tanya had no idea that this simple moment of kindness would completely transform her family's future, or that the confused tourist was actually one of the most powerful real estate developers in the city, testing whether compassion still existed among strangers. Sometimes the smallest acts of humanity create the biggest miracles. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The fluorescent lights of the subway station buzzed overhead as Tanya Rodriguez hurried down the concrete steps, her worn sneakers making soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor. She checked her phone again, the blue light illuminating her tired face in the early morning dimness. Her shift at Morrison Financial Tower started at 7:30 sharp, and being late wasn't an option when you were barely keeping your head above water financially. The cleaning company had made it clear that punctuality was non-negotiable, especially for employees like her who couldn't afford to lose even one of their 3 jobs. Her backpack bounced against her shoulder as she navigated through the growing crowd of commuters, each person lost in their own morning routine of coffee cups and smartphone screens. Tanya had perfected the art of moving quickly through crowds during her 2 years of juggling multiple jobs across the city. She knew which subway car would put her closest to the exit at her destination, which streets had less foot traffic for faster walking, and exactly how many minutes she needed between each commitment to avoid being late. But as she approached the large transit map mounted on the station wall, something made her slow her purposeful stride. A woman stood directly in front of the map, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing routes while her other hand clutched a wrinkled piece of paper. She wore an expensive-looking navy blazer and matching pants, the kind of professional outfit Tanya had always admired in storefront windows, but never had reason to own. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she carried a leather purse that probably cost more than Tanya made in a month. What caught Tanya's attention wasn't the woman's obvious affluence, but the way her shoulders had begun to shake slightly, and how she kept looking around with the desperate expression of someone completely out of their element. In a city where people walked past each other without making eye contact, this woman's distress was like a beacon calling for help. Tanya glanced at her phone again. 15 minutes now. She could still make it if she hurried, but something in the woman's posture reminded her of how she'd felt during her first week in the city 3 years ago, when every street corner looked the same and every subway map seemed designed to confuse rather than help. The memory of that overwhelming loneliness made her decision for her. "Excuse me," Tanya said, approaching the woman with a gentle smile. "You look like you might need some help finding your way around." The woman turned, and Tanya could see that her eyes were indeed glossy with unshed tears. Up close, she looked to be in her early 40s, with the kind of composed beauty that spoke of expensive skincare routines and regular salon visits. But beneath that polished exterior, she seemed genuinely frightened and overwhelmed. "Oh, thank you," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'm supposed to meet someone at something called Columbus Circle, but I had no idea how to get there from here. I've been staring at this map for 10 minutes and it might as well be written in hieroglyphics." Tanya felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She remembered standing in this exact spot during her first month in the city, holding a similar piece of paper with an address that might as well have been on another planet. A kind stranger had helped her that day, explaining not just the directions but also which car to board and how to recognize her stop. That moment of human connection had meant everything to someone who felt invisible in such a massive city. "Columbus Circle isn't too complicated from here," Tanya said, moving closer to the map. "You'll want to take the blue line north for about 12 stops. But the tricky part is that there are actually two different exits at Columbus Circle, and depending on where exactly you're meeting someone, you might come up on the wrong side of the street. The woman's face brightened with relief, and she pulled out her phone to show Tanya the address. It's this building here, and I'm supposed to be there by 8 o'clock. I left my hotel thinking I had plenty of time, but I got turned around somewhere and now I'm completely lost. Tanya studied the address on the phone screen. Recognizing it as one of the newer high-rise buildings that had transformed the Columbus Circle area over the past few years. She'd cleaned offices in that neighborhood during her brief stint with a different cleaning company, before finding her current position that paid slightly better. Okay, I know exactly where that is, Tanya said, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at being able to help. From Columbus Circle Station, you'll want to use the northwest exit, which will put you right across from the Time Warner building. Then you walk about 2 blocks north and your building will be on the right side of the street. It's the one with the really modern glass facade and the small plaza in front. The woman listened intently, but Tanya could see confusion still clouding her features. Directions that made perfect sense to someone familiar with the city could sound like foreign language to a newcomer, especially someone who was already stressed about being on time. Actually, Tanya said, checking her phone once more, I'm heading in that general direction anyway. If you want, I could ride with you and make sure you find the right exit. Sometimes those underground station layouts can be confusing even when you know where you're going. The offer surprised even Tanya herself. She hadn't planned to deviate from her carefully timed morning routine. And accompanying this stranger would definitely make her cut it close for her own appointment. But something about the woman's genuine distress had touched a chord in her. In a city where people often treated each other as obstacles to navigate around, there was something powerful about the opportunity to simply be kind. Would you really do that? The woman asked, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't want to impose, but I have to admit I'm a little panicked about being late. This meeting is incredibly important to me. Of course, Tanya said, shouldering her backpack more securely. We're all just trying to get where we need to go, right? Besides, I remember what it felt like to be new to the city. Someone helped me once when I was lost, and I always promised myself I'd pay it forward when I had the chance. They walked together toward the platform, joining the growing crowd of morning commuters waiting for the next train. The woman introduced herself as Victoria, explaining that she was visiting from Seattle for a series of business meetings. She asked Tanya about her work, and Tanya found herself sharing more than she usually did with strangers. I actually have 3 different jobs, Tanya explained as they waited for the train. I clean offices downtown in the mornings, work at a dry cleaner in the afternoons, and do evening shifts at a diner in Queens. It sounds exhausting when I say it out loud, but you do what you have to do, especially when you have kids depending on you. Victoria listened with what seemed like genuine interest, asking follow-up questions about Tanya's daughters and how she managed such a demanding schedule. There was something refreshing about her curiosity, the way she asked questions without the pitying tone that some people used when they learned about Tanya's situation. Your daughters are lucky to have such a dedicated mother, Victoria said as their train pulled into the station. It can't be easy balancing so much responsibility. Tanya felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. It wasn't often that anyone acknowledged the effort it took to keep her family afloat, let alone a stranger who had no reason to care about her struggles. Most people, when they learned about her multiple jobs, either changed the subject or offered unsolicited advice about going back to school or finding a better career path. As if she hadn't already considered every possible option. They found seats together on the train, and Victoria continued asking thoughtful questions about life in the city. She wanted to know about the best neighborhoods for families, which schools had good reputations, and where someone could find affordable groceries. Her questions struck Tanya as oddly specific for someone who was just visiting, but she answered them gladly, happy to share knowledge. That might be useful. The area where I live in Queens isn't fancy, but it's safe and the schools are decent, Tanya explained as the train moved through the tunnel. The rent is more manageable than Manhattan, and there's a real sense of community. My neighbors look out for each other's kids, which is invaluable when you're a single parent working multiple jobs. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, taking mental notes of everything Tanya shared. She seemed particularly interested when Tanya mentioned the challenges of finding reliable childcare and the way the community had rallied around families facing financial hardships. It sounds like you've built a good life for your family despite the challenges, Victoria observed. That takes real strength and resourcefulness. Tanya felt herself blushing slightly at the praise. She wasn't used to having her efforts recognized in such a straightforward way, without any underlying judgment or suggestion that she should be doing more. Victoria's words carried a weight of respect that made Tanya sit a little straighter in her seat. As they approached Columbus Circle, Tanya began pointing out landmarks through the train windows, helping Victoria get oriented for future trips. She explained which exits led to different parts of the neighborhood and shared tips about navigating the busy intersection above ground. The key is to remember that Columbus Circle is basically a big roundabout, Tanya said as they prepared to exit the train. Once you get your bearings from the center, everything else falls into place. And don't be afraid to ask for directions if you get confused. Most New Yorkers are actually pretty helpful, despite their reputation. They emerged from the subway station into the bright morning sunlight, and Tanya immediately began orienting Victoria toward her destination. The area around Columbus Circle buzzed with its usual morning energy, a mixture of tourists heading to Central Park, professionals rushing to office buildings, and vendors setting up their carts for the day ahead. Your building is just up this way, Tanya said, leading Victoria through the crosswalk. We'll walk along the park for about 2 blocks, and then you'll see it on your right. It's pretty distinctive, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding it again if you need to come back. As they walked, Victoria continued asking questions about the neighborhood, showing particular interest in the residential buildings they passed. She commented on the architecture, the green spaces, and the general atmosphere of the area with the keen eye of someone who understood urban development. This whole area has really transformed over the past decade, Victoria observed as they walked past a newly renovated apartment complex. The investment in infrastructure and mixed-use development has created such a vibrant community feeling. Tanya was impressed by Victoria's knowledge of urban planning concepts, though she found it slightly unusual for a casual tourist. But people had all sorts of professional backgrounds and interests. And perhaps Victoria's business meetings were related to development or city planning in some way. They arrived at Victoria's destination with 10 minutes to spare. A gleaming office tower that stretched toward the sky with its facade of tinted glass and steel. The small plaza in front featured modern sculptures and carefully maintained landscaping, creating an impression of prosperity and professional success. This is it, Tanya announced, checking the address on the building directory to confirm. You'll want to go through the main entrance there, and the elevators should be straight ahead once you're inside the lobby. Victoria turned to face Tanya, and for a moment, her composed professional demeanor seemed to crack slightly, revealing something that looked almost like sadness or regret underneath. I can't thank you enough for this, Victoria said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. You didn't have to go out of your way to help a complete stranger, especially when you had your own schedule to worry about. Your kindness today means more than you know. Tanya felt a flutter of concern as she checked her phone and realized that helping Victoria had made her later than she'd planned. She would need to take a taxi to reach her cleaning job on time. An unexpected expense that would stretch her already tight weekly budget. But looking at Victoria's grateful expression, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision to help. Anyone would have done the same thing, Tanya said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd seen plenty of people walk past others who clearly needed help, too absorbed in their own concerns to spare a moment for AE. Stranger's distress. I hope your meeting goes well, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit to the city. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Tanya's hand. Please, if you're ever in this neighborhood and need anything, don't hesitate to call. I'd love to return the favor somehow. Tanya glanced at the card, noting that it was elegantly printed on heavy cardstock but contained only Victoria's name and a phone number. With no company name or job title listed, it struck her as unusual, but she tucked it into her backpack without comment. Take care of yourself, Victoria said, giving Tanya's hand a brief squeeze before heading toward the building entrance. And thank you again for reminding me that there are still genuinely good people in this world. Tanya watched Victoria disappear through the revolving doors before turning to find the nearest taxi stand. As she hurried toward her next destination, she found herself thinking about their conversation and wondering what kind of business brought someone like Victoria to the city. There had been something almost wistful about her questions, as if she were searching for something beyond just directions to a meeting. The taxi ride to the financial district cost more than Tanya had hoped. Eating into the small buffer she tried to maintain in her checking account for unexpected expenses, but as she rushed through the lobby of Morrison Financial Tower and hurried to the service elevator that would take her to the cleaning supply closet, she couldn't bring herself to regret helping Victoria. There had been something special about that interaction, a moment of genuine human connection that felt increasingly rare in her daily routine. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was waiting by the supply closet with her usual clipboard and stern expression. Mrs. Chen ran the cleaning crew with military precision, tracking every minute of their shifts and maintaining exacting standards for each floor they serviced. You're 7 minutes late, Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen said without looking up from her clipboard. That's the second time this month. I hope you have a good explanation. Tanya felt her heart sink as she quickly pulled on her uniform and grabbed her cart of supplies. Being late twice in 1 month was grounds for a formal warning. And 3 warnings could lead to termination. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due next week and her daughters needing new school clothes for the upcoming semester. I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen, Tanya said, checking to make sure her cart had everything she needed for the morning's assignments. I helped someone who was lost find their way to an important meeting. It won't happen again. Mrs. Chen finally looked up from her clipboard, her expression skeptical. Your job is to be here on time and clean these offices, not to play tour guide for tourists. These corporate clients pay us good money to maintain their spaces, and they expect professional reliability. I'm putting you on notice, Rodriguez. One more late arrival and we'll have to discuss your future with this company. Tanya nodded, accepting the reprimand without argument. She understood Mrs. Chen's position and knew that making excuses would only make the situation worse. The cleaning industry operated on thin margins and tight schedules, leaving little room for flexibility when it came to staffing and punctuality. She spent the morning working with extra efficiency, determined to demonstrate her value to the company despite her tardiness. Each office she cleaned received her full attention, from carefully dusting every surface to ensuring that the windows were streak-free and the carpets were properly vacuumed. The physical work helped her process the morning's events, and she found herself thinking about Victoria's grateful expression and the genuine warmth of their conversation. During her brief lunch break, Tanya called her neighbor Rosa to check on her daughters. Rosa lived in the apartment next door and had been a godsend since Tanya had started working multiple jobs. An older woman whose own children had grown and moved away. Rosa seemed to genuinely enjoy having Maya and Sophia around, and she never made Tanya feel guilty about the hours she had to spend away from home. The girls are fine, Mija, Rosa assured her over the phone. Maya finished her summer reading assignment this morning, and Sophia is helping me water the plants on the fire escape. They had cereal and fruit for breakfast, and I'm planning to make them grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. Tanya felt the familiar knot of guilt that came with relying so heavily on Rosa's kindness. Her neighbor never asked for payment and always brushed off Tanya's attempts to compensate her for the childcare. But Tanya knew she was taking advantage of Rosa's generous spirit. The arrangement worked because it had to work, but Tanya dreamed of a time when she could afford proper after-school care and wouldn't need to depend on her by neighbors' goodwill. "Tell them I love them, and I'll see them tonight after my diner shift," Tanya said. "And Rosa, thank you as always. I don't know what we'd do without you." "Family takes care of family," Rosa replied, using the phrase she always employed when Tanya tried to thank her. In Rosa's worldview, the apartment building formed an extended family unit, and helping each other was simply what neighbors did. Tanya had never experienced that kind of community support before moving to their building, and it had made all the difference in her ability to manage her complicated schedule. The afternoon at the dry cleaner passed in its usual rhythm of sorting garments, operating the pressing machines, and helping customers retrieve their clothes. The work was repetitive but satisfying in its own way, and Tanya had developed friendly relationships with several of the regular customers who appreciated her attention to detail and helpful attitude. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who brought in her late husband's suits to be cleaned and pressed even though she had no one to wear them for, always asked about Tanya's daughters and shared stories about her own children's accomplishments. Mr. Kim, who owned a small restaurant in the neighborhood, often brought Tanya leftover food from his kitchen, knowing that she worked long hours and might not have time for proper meals. These small interactions throughout her day provided moments of connection that helped sustain Tanya through the challenges of her situation. Each person who took a moment to acknowledge her as more than just a service provider reminded her that she was part of a larger community, even when her circumstances made her feel isolated and struggling. By the time she finished her shift at the dry cleaner and headed to her evening job at the diner in Queens, Tanya was running on reserves of energy she'd built up over months of maintaining this grueling schedule. The diner job was the most demanding of her 3 positions, requiring her to be on her feet for 6 hours straight while juggling multiple tables and dealing with customers who ranged from friendly regulars to demanding complainers. But the tips from the diner made it worthwhile, often providing the extra money that allowed her to buy small luxuries for her daughters or handle unexpected expenses that would otherwise throw their budget into chaos. On good nights, she could make an additional $50 to $70 in tips, money that went directly toward building a small emergency fund or purchasing things like new books for Maya or art supplies for Sophia. The evening shift at the diner introduced Tanya to a different cross-section of the city's population. Late-night diners attracted everyone from hospital workers finishing long shifts to young couples on dates to insomniacs seeking comfort food and human connection. Tanya had become skilled at reading her customers' moods and needs, knowing when someone wanted efficient service and when they needed a friendly ear or a moment of companionship. As she served coffee to a lonely-looking man who came in every Tuesday night and ordered the same turkey sandwich, Tanya found herself thinking again about her encounter with Victoria that morning. There had been something almost familiar about Victoria's loneliness, despite her obvious affluence and professional success. Beneath the expensive clothes and polished appearance, she had seemed like someone searching for authentic human connection, just like many of the customers who found their way to the diner during the quiet hours of the night. The shift ended just after midnight, and Tanya made her way home through the nearly empty streets of Queens. The neighborhood looked different at this hour, with most of the family apartments dark and quiet, their residents sleeping before another day of work and school and the countless small responsibilities that filled their lives. She climbed the stairs to her 4th-floor apartment as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake Rosa or her daughters. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and she stepped into the small space that contained everything she cared most about in the world. Maya and Sophia were asleep in the bed they shared in the apartment's single bedroom, their dark hair spread across pillows that Tanya had covered with cases featuring their favorite cartoon characters. Maya, at 12, was beginning to develop the angular features that would make her beautiful as she grew older, while 8-year-old Sophia still retained the round cheeks and button nose of childhood. Tanya stood in the doorway for a moment, watching their peaceful sleep and feeling the familiar mixture of love and determination that fueled her daily efforts. Everything she did, every difficult hour and every exhausting day, was for them. She wanted to give them opportunities she'd never had, to help them build futures that wouldn't require the kind of grinding struggle that had defined her own adult life. She prepared for bed quietly, setting her alarm for 5:30 the next morning so she could begin the cycle again. As she settled onto the fold-out couch that served as her bed, Tanya found Victoria's business card in her backpack and looked at it again in the dim light from the street lamp outside their window. The simple elegance of the card, with its heavy paper and understated design, spoke of a level of professional success that seemed almost foreign to Tanya's world. But she remembered Victoria's genuine gratitude and the way she had listened with real interest to Tanya's stories about her life and neighborhood. There had been something authentic about their interaction that transcended their obvious differences in economic circumstances. Tanya tucked the card into the small box where she kept important documents and mementos, thinking that she probably would never have reason to contact Victoria but wanting to preserve the memory of their encounter. It had been a bright spot in an otherwise routine day, a reminder that kindness could create unexpected connections between strangers who might never cross paths again. 3 weeks later, Tanya was rushing through her morning routine when she heard a loud knock at her apartment door. The sound was authoritative and persistent, the kind of knocking that suggested official business rather than a friendly neighbor stopping by for a chat. She opened the door to find a man in a rumpled suit holding a manila envelope and a clipboard. His appearance and demeanor immediately triggered alarm bells in Tanya's mind, and she felt her stomach clench with anxiety even before he spoke. "Tanya Rodriguez?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, that's me," Tanya replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to serve you with this notice," the man said, thrusting the envelope toward her. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The building has been sold, and the new owners are planning renovations that require all current tenants to relocate." Tanya's hands shook as she accepted the envelope, her mind reeling from the implications of what she'd just heard. 30 days to find a new apartment, gather the money for a security deposit and first month's rent, and relocate her entire family during the middle of the school year. "There must be some mistake," she managed to say. "We have a lease that runs through next spring. Our landlord never said anything about selling the building." The man shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "The new owners have the right to terminate existing leases for major renovations. It's all explained in the notice. You should probably contact a tenants' rights organization if you have questions about your legal options." He left without another word, and Tanya closed the door behind him with trembling hands. She slumped against the door frame and opened the envelope, reading through the legal language that confirmed her worst fears. The building had indeed been sold to a development company that planned to gut renovate all the apartments and convert them to luxury condos. All existing tenants were required to vacate within 30 days, with no provisions for relocation assistance or temporary housing. Maya appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes and looking concerned by her mother's obvious distress. "Mom, what's wrong?" Maya asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "Who was at the door?" Tanya forced herself to smile and fold the notice back into its envelope, not wanting to frighten her daughter before she'd had time to process the situation and develop a plan. "Just some paperwork about the building, sweetheart," Tanya said, moving toward the kitchen to start breakfast with an appearance of normalcy. "Nothing for you to worry about. Why don't you wake up Sophia and get ready for breakfast?" But as Maya disappeared back into the bedroom, Tanya allowed her composure to crumble slightly. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter and took deep breaths, trying to push down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Finding a new apartment in their price range would be nearly impossible, especially with only 30 days to search and the need to come up with thousands of dollars for moving expenses. Most landlords required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit up front, meaning she would need to accumulate more money than she typically saw in several months of combined income from her 3 jobs. The thought of potentially having to move her daughters to a different neighborhood, away from their school and the community that had become their support system, made her feel physically sick. Maya and Sophia had friends in the building and knew all the local shop owners and community members who looked out for them. Starting over somewhere else would mean rebuilding all of those relationships and support networks from scratch. Tanya managed to get through the morning routine of preparing breakfast and getting the girls ready for their day without letting her anxiety show. She hugged them both a little tighter than usual before they left to spend the day with Rosa, and she promised to bring home their favorite takeout for dinner that evening. But as she made her way to her first job of the day, Tanya's mind raced with increasingly desperate scenarios for solving their housing crisis. She could try to find a 4th job to increase her income, but there were only so many hours in the day, and she was already stretched to her physical and emotional limits. She could apply for emergency housing assistance, but she knew from other families in the building that such programs had long waiting lists and complex application processes that might not provide help within their 30-day deadline. The cleaning job that morning felt like a blur of routine tasks performed while her mind churned through possibilities and calculations. Mrs. Chen noticed her distraction and commented on her unusually quiet demeanor, but Tanya couldn't bring herself to explain the situation. She wasn't ready to face the pity or unsolicited advice that would inevitably follow such a revelation. During her lunch break, she called several rental agencies and quickly discovered that available apartments in their price range were scarce and usually required immediate occupancy. The few options that might work for their family were located in neighborhoods that would require Maya and Sophia to change schools, disrupting their education and separating them from their current friends and teachers. By the time she arrived at the dry cleaner for her afternoon shift, Tanya felt as though she was drowning. The weight of responsibility for her daughter's stability and well-being pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, and she struggled to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor with customers. Mrs. Patterson noticed her distress immediately when she came in to collect her weekly dry cleaning order. "My dear, you look absolutely exhausted," the elderly woman said, studying Tanya's face with concern. "Is everything all right at home?" The genuine kindness in Mrs. Patterson's voice nearly broke through Tanya's determination to handle the crisis privately. For a moment she was tempted to unburden herself to this woman who had always treated her with such consistent warmth and respect. "Just dealing with some housing issues," Tanya admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Nothing that can't be worked out with a little time and effort." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious, and she leaned closer to the counter as if preparing to share confidential information. "Housing problems in this city can escalate quickly if you don't have the right resources," she said quietly. "If you need recommendations for tenant advocacy organizations or legal assistance, I have some contacts who might be able to help. Sometimes knowing the right people to call can make all the difference." Tanya felt a flutter of hope at the offer, though she wasn't sure how much help legal advocacy could provide when the eviction notice appeared to be entirely legitimate. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," she said. "I may take you up on that offer if things get more complicated." The older woman nodded and patted Tanya's hand across the counter before collecting her clothes and heading toward the door. "Remember, dear, asking for help isn't a sign of weakness," she said. "It's a sign of wisdom. Don't try to carry the whole world on your shoulders alone." The evening shift at the diner proved to be busier than usual, which was both a blessing and a challenge. The increased number of customers meant more potential tips, money that Tanya desperately needed for their housing search, but it also meant less time to think through their options and develop a concrete plan for the next 30 days. As she served coffee and took orders and cleared tables, part of her mind remained focused on the logistics of their situation. She needed to research available apartments, calculate moving costs, and figure out how to accumulate the necessary funds for deposits and fees. She also needed to prepare Maya and Sophia for the possibility of significant changes to their living situation, though she wanted to delay that conversation until she had more definitive information about their options. During a brief lull in the dinner rush, Tanya found herself thinking about Victoria and their encounter 3 weeks earlier. She remembered Victoria's genuine interest in her neighborhood and her thoughtful questions about community life and family resources in Queens. There'd been something almost wistful about Victoria's curiosity, as if she were searching for the kind of authentic connections that Tanya had found in her current neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on Tanya that she was about to lose the very thing that Victoria had seemed to admire most about her life, the sense of community and belonging that came from being part of a neighborhood where people looked out for each other. The building where they lived had become more than just affordable housing. It had become the foundation of their support system and social connections. When her shift ended just after midnight, Tanya walked home through the familiar streets with a heavy heart. Tomorrow she would need to start making phone calls and scheduling apartment viewings, beginning the exhausting process of trying to rebuild their lives in a new location with limited time and resources. She climbed the stairs to their apartment quietly, but as she reached their floor, she noticed Rosa waiting in the hallway outside her own door. "Mija, I need to talk to you," Rosa said, her voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. Tanya felt her anxiety spike, wondering if something had happened with the girls or if Rosa had received her own eviction notice. "Is everything okay?" Tanya asked, fumbling with her keys while trying to read Rosa's expression in the dim hallway light. "The girls are fine. They're sleeping," Rosa assured her. "But I heard about the eviction notices today. Mrs. Gonzalez from the second floor told me that everyone in the building received them." Tanya nodded, feeling some relief that she wouldn't have to explain the situation to Rosa from the beginning. "I've been trying to figure out our options," Tanya said. 30 days isn't much time, but I'm hoping we can find something that will work for our family." Rosa stepped closer and placed a motherly hand on Tanya's arm. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 25 years, and I've seen what happens when developers buy buildings and force out longtime residents. They promise renovations and improvements. But what they really want is to push out families like ours so they can charge 3 times the rent to newcomers who can afford luxury prices." Tanya felt her shoulders sag as the full implications of their situation became clearer. "So, you think there's no chance of finding comparable housing in the neighborhood?" she asked. "Not at the prices we've been paying," Rosa replied sadly. "The days of affordable rent in decent neighborhoods are disappearing all over the city. Families like ours are being pushed further and further away from the communities where we've built our lives." They talked for a few more minutes about the building's situation and the other families who were facing the same displacement. Rosa promised to share any information she gathered about potential housing options, and they agreed to coordinate their searches so they could provide references for each other if needed. As Tanya finally entered her own apartment and prepared for bed, she felt the weight of their circumstances settling over her like a heavy blanket. The next 30 days would test every resource and connection she had built during their 3 years in the city, and she wasn't sure whether her efforts would be enough to maintain stability for her daughters. She set her alarm for even earlier than usual, knowing that she would need to squeeze apartment hunting into her already packed schedule. As she settled onto the fold-out couch, Tanya whispered a prayer for strength and guidance, hoping that somehow they would find a way through this crisis without losing everything they had worked so hard to build. The next morning brought a steady rain that seemed to match Tanya's mood as she hurried through her usual routine. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her mind churning through housing possibilities and worst-case scenarios that left her feeling exhausted before the day had even begun. Maya noticed her mother's distraction during breakfast and asked several questions about their plans for the upcoming weekend, but Tanya found it difficult to focus on normal family activities when their entire living situation remained uncertain. "Mom, you seem really worried about something," Maya observed as she finished her cereal. "Are you sure everything is okay?" Tanya forced herself to focus on her daughter's concerned expression, realizing that her anxiety was becoming obvious despite her efforts to maintain normalcy. "I'm just dealing with some grown-up stuff about our apartment," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Nothing dangerous or scary, just some paperwork and phone calls that I need to handle. Sometimes being an adult means worrying about boring things that kids don't need to think about." Maya nodded, but Tanya could see that her 12-year-old daughter wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation. Maya had always been perceptive beyond her years, a quality that came from growing up in a household where resources were limited and everyone needed to be aware of potential problems. After dropping the girls off with Rosa, Tanya spent her commute to work making phone calls to rental agencies and apartment listing services. The responses were uniformly discouraging, with most available apartments either far beyond their budget or located in neighborhoods that would require hour-long commutes to her various jobs. The cleaning shift at Morrison Financial Tower passed in a haze of routine tasks, while her mind remained focused on their housing crisis. Mrs. Chen noticed her continued distraction and pulled her aside during their mid-morning break. "Rodriguez, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but it's affecting your work performance," Mrs. Chen said bluntly. "Yesterday you left streaks on the windows in Suite 4200, and this morning I found dust on the conference table in Suite 3800. Our clients pay premium rates for perfect service, and I can't have my employees delivering substandard results." Tanya felt heat rise in her cheeks as she absorbed the criticism. She prided herself on the quality of her work, and knowing that her personal problems were compromising her professional standards added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. "I apologize, Mrs. Chen," she said. "I'm dealing with some housing issues at home, but I understand that's no excuse for poor performance. It won't happen again." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly at Tanya's straightforward acknowledgement of the problem. "Look, Rodriguez, you're normally one of my most reliable employees," she said. "But this is a business, and I have obligations to our clients and the company. Whatever is going on at home, you need to find a way to leave it at home. Can you do that?" Tanya nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how she would manage to compartmentalize her anxiety about their living situation. The 30-day deadline felt like a ticking clock that followed her everywhere, making it difficult to focus on anything else for extended periods. She spent her lunch break visiting 2 potential apartments that had seemed promising based on their online listings. The first was located in a basement with no natural light and a persistent odor of mold that made her think immediately of health concerns for Maya and Sophia. The second was in better condition but located next to an elevated train line that filled the rooms with noise every few minutes as trains passed overhead. Neither option felt like a place where her daughters could thrive, but Tanya forced herself to take notes and ask practical questions about lease terms and move-in requirements. She was beginning to understand that their choices might be limited to apartments that were merely tolerable rather than places they would genuinely want to call home. The afternoon shift at the dry cleaner brought a welcome distraction from her housing search, though she found herself calculating potential moving costs during quiet moments between customers. Every expense associated with relocating seemed to require money she didn't have, from hiring a moving truck to paying utility deposits at a new address. Mr. Kim stopped by during the afternoon to drop off his restaurant uniforms and noticed Tanya's subdued demeanor. "You seem troubled today," he observed in his direct but kindly way. "Is there something I can help with?" Tanya was touched by his offer, but wasn't sure how to explain their situation without sounding like she was asking for financial assistance. "Just some family logistics to work out," she said. "Nothing that can't be handled with a little time and planning." Mr. Kim studied her face for a moment, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. "My cousin works for a property management company that handles affordable housing units," he said. "They sometimes have apartments that don't get advertised publicly. Call this number and mention my name. It might not lead to anything, but it's worth a conversation." Tanya accepted the card gratefully, feeling a small spark of hope at the possibility of accessing housing options that weren't available through regular rental listings. "Thank you, Mr. Kim," she said. "I really appreciate you thinking of us." "Good people deserve good opportunities," he replied simply. "Sometimes it just takes knowing the right person to connect you with what you need." As her shift at the dry cleaner ended and she prepared to head to her evening job at the diner, Tanya called the number on Mr. Kim's card. The conversation was brief but encouraging, with the property manager agreeing to meet with her the following day to discuss available units that might fit their budget and timeline. The diner shift proved to be slower than usual, giving Tanya more time to think, but also meaning fewer tips to add to their moving fund. She found herself serving several customers who seemed to be dealing with their own personal struggles, and their quiet conversations about job searches and family challenges reminded her that she wasn't alone in Burr, facing financial difficulties. An older man who came in regularly for coffee and pie mentioned that his landlord had raised his rent by 40%, forcing him to consider moving in with his adult son despite preferring to maintain his borough. Independence. A young woman studying nursing while working 2 part-time jobs confided that she was living in her car some nights because she couldn't afford both rent and textbooks. These encounters reminded Tanya that housing insecurity affected people from all walks of life in the city, and that her family's situation was part of a larger pattern of economic pressure that made basic stability increasingly difficult to achieve for working families. As she walked home through the quiet streets after midnight, Tanya found herself thinking about the contrast between her bolas. Current anxiety and the sense of hope she had felt just a few weeks earlier when helping Victoria find her way to Columbus Circle. That morning had reminded her of the satisfaction that came from being able to help someone else, from having knowledge and resources that could make a difference in a stranger's day. Now she was the one who needed help, and the vulnerability of that position felt uncomfortable and frightening. She had worked so hard to build independence and stability for her family, and the possibility of losing their home threatened to undermine everything she had accomplished over the past 3 years. The next few days passed in a blur of apartment viewings, phone calls to rental agencies, and attempts to maintain her normal work performance while managing her growing anxiety about their housing situation. Each potential apartment seemed to have significant drawbacks, whether in terms of location, condition, cost, or lease requirements that were difficult for her to meet. The property manager recommended by Mr. Kim did have several units available, but they were located in neighborhoods that would require Maya and Sophia to change schools and would add significant commuting time to Tanya's already complicated work schedule. The rent was more manageable than most other options she had explored, but the practical challenges of rebuilding their entire routine around a new location felt overwhelming. Rosa had been conducting her own apartment search with similar results, and their evening conversations in the hallway had become sessions of mutual support and shared frustration about the limited options available to families in their income bracket. "I keep thinking there must be something we're missing," Rosa said one evening as they compared notes about their respective searches. "Some resource or program or connection that could open up better possibilities?" Tanya nodded, though she had already researched every assistance program and housing resource she could find online. Most had waiting lists that were months or years long, application processes that required extensive documentation, or eligibility requirements that didn't match their specific circumstances. 2 weeks into their 30-day deadline, Tanya was beginning to accept that they would need to choose the least problematic of the available options, even if it meant significant compromises to their quality of life and community connections. She had started preparing Maya and Sophia for the possibility of changing schools, trying to frame the potential move as an adventure rather than a disruption to their stability. It was during this period of reluctantly accepting their limited options that Tanya received an unexpected phone call while she was taking a brief break during her cleaning shift. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail rather than interrupting her work schedule to answer an unknown call. "Hello, is this Tanya Rodriguez?" asked a familiar voice that she couldn't immediately place. "Yes, this is Tanya," she replied, stepping into an empty conference room for privacy. "This is Victoria. We met a few weeks ago when you helped me find my way to Columbus Circle," the caller said. "I hope you remember our conversation." Tanya felt a surge of surprise and curiosity at hearing from Victoria after so much time had passed. She had assumed their brief encounter was the kind of one-time interaction that happened frequently in a large city, meaningful in the moment but not likely to lead to ongoing connection. "Of course I remember," Tanya said. "How are you? Did your business meetings go well?" "They did. Thank you for asking," Victoria replied. "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I've been thinking about our conversation and the things you told me about your neighborhood and community. I'm wondering if you might have some time to meet for coffee and continue that discussion." Tanya was intrigued by the request, but also acutely aware of her packed schedule and the demands of her housing search. "I'd like that," she said honestly, "but my schedule is pretty crazy right now. I'm dealing with some housing issues that are taking up most of my free time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Victoria spoke again, her voice carried a note of concern. "Housing issues can be incredibly stressful," she said. "If you don't mind me asking, is it something related to affordability or availability?" Tanya found herself sharing more details about their eviction notice and apartment search than she had intended, perhaps because Victoria's voice carried the same genuine interest and empathy that had made their initial conversation so comfortable. "That's exactly the kind of situation I was hoping to discuss with you," Victoria said when Tanya finished explaining their circumstances. "Would you be willing to meet me tomorrow evening? I think I might have some information that could be helpful to your situation." The offer seemed too good to be true, but Tanya's desperation about their housing crisis made her willing to explore any possibility that might provide assistance or guidance. "I finish my diner shift at midnight," she said. "I could meet you somewhere after that, or during my lunch break tomorrow if that works better for your schedule." "Actually, let me come to you," Victoria said. "What's the address of your current apartment? I'd like to see the neighborhood you've been telling me about." Tanya hesitated for a moment, unsure about inviting someone she barely knew to her home, especially given their current vulnerability about losing their housing. But something about Victoria's tone suggested genuine helpfulness rather than idle curiosity. She provided the address and agreed to meet Victoria outside her building the following evening after her diner shift. As she ended the call and returned to her cleaning duties, Tanya felt a mixture of hope and skepticism about what Victoria might be able to offer. At this point, she was willing to consider any assistance, even if it turned out to be nothing more than moral support and encouragement. The next evening, Tanya hurried home from the diner with unusual anticipation about her meeting with Victoria. She had spent much of her shift wondering what kind of information or assistance Victoria might be able to provide, and whether their encounter would lead to practical help with their housing situation. As she turned the corner onto her street, Tanya was surprised to see a sleek black SUV parked outside her building, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights and looking distinctly out of place in the working class neighborhood. She assumed it belonged to someone visiting one of the other families in the building, perhaps a relative with more financial resources than the typical residents. But as she approached the building entrance, the driver's door of the SUV opened and Victoria stepped out, looking dramatically different from the confused tourist Tanya had helped 3 weeks earlier. Gone were the wrinkled clothes and anxious expression, replaced by a perfectly tailored business suit, professional hairstyling, and an air of confidence that spoke of authority and success. For a moment, Tanya wondered if she had mistaken this woman for someone else. But Victoria's smile and greeting confirmed her identity even as her transformed appearance raised new questions about their initial praz. Encounter. Tanya, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me, Victoria said, extending her hand in a gesture that felt more formal than their previous interaction. I hope I'm not keeping you up too late after your long workday. Not at all, Tanya replied, though she felt suddenly self-conscious about her own appearance after hours of serving tables at the diner. I have to admit, I'm curious about what kind of information you think might be helpful to our housing situation. Victoria's expression grew more serious, and she gestured toward the building entrance. Would it be possible for us to go inside and talk privately? She asked. What I have to share with you is somewhat sensitive, and I'd prefer to have our conversation away from the street. Tanya nodded and led Victoria up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, acutely aware of the contrast between Victoria's obvious affluence and the modest surroundings of their building. The hallway lighting was dim, the carpet was worn in places, and the walls showed the kind of minor damage that accumulated over years in affordable housing. But as they climbed the stairs, Victoria seemed to be taking in every detail of the building with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional assessment. She commented on the solid construction of the staircase, the adequate lighting in the common areas, and the general cleanliness and maintenance despite the building's obvious age. This is exactly the kind of building that developers target for conversion, Victoria observed as they reached Tanya's floor. Good bones, decent location, and residents who have invested in creating a real community. Tanya unlocked her apartment door and invited Victoria inside, apologizing for the modest furnishings and the fold-out couch that served as her bed. But Victoria seemed more interested in the family photos on the walls and the children's artwork displayed on the refrigerator than in making judgments about their economic circumstances. Your daughters are beautiful, Victoria said, studying a recent school photo of Maya and Sophia. They look happy and confident, which says a lot about the kind of mother you are. Tanya felt a familiar warmth at the compliment, though she remained curious about the purpose of Victoria's visit and the dramatic change in her appearance and demeanor since their first meeting. Please sit down, Tanya said, gesturing toward the small couch. Can I get you something to drink? I have coffee, tea, or water. Coffee would be wonderful, thank you, Victoria replied, settling onto the couch and continuing to look around the apartment with professional interest. As Tanya prepared coffee in the small kitchen area, she found herself stealing glances at Victoria and trying to understand the transformation she was witnessing. The woman sitting in her living room bore little resemblance to the confused tourist she had helped navigate the subway system, yet their conversation maintained the same tone of genuine interest and mutual respect. Tanya, I need to be completely honest with you about who I am and why I'm here, Victoria said as Tanya handed her a cup of coffee. 3 weeks ago, when you helped me find my way to Columbus Circle, I wasn't actually lost or confused about the city. Tanya felt a chill of apprehension as she settled into the chair across from Victoria, wondering if she had somehow been deceived or manipulated during their initial encounter. I'm the CEO of Meridian Development Group, Victoria continued. We're one of the largest real estate development companies in the city, and we specialize in urban renewal projects and affordable housing initiatives. The name Meridian Development Group sounded familiar to Tanya, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it. But Victoria's revelation explained her transformed appearance and the expensive SUV parked outside the building. 3 weeks ago, I was conducting what we call a community assessment, Victoria explained. I dress down and present myself as someone unfamiliar with the area in order to observe how residents interact with strangers. What kind of community spirit exists in different neighborhoods, and whether there are individuals who demonstrate the kind of character and leadership that suggests a strong social fabric. Tanya felt a mixture of confusion and growing unease as she processed Victoria's explanation. The interaction that had felt so genuine and spontaneous now seemed calculated and manipulative, though she wasn't sure what Victoria's ultimate purpose might be. "I've been doing these assessments for 5 years now," Victoria continued. "And I have to tell you that what you showed me that morning was extraordinary. You not only helped a stranger find her way, you went significantly out of your way to ensure that I reached my destination safely, even when it made you late for your own commitments." "I still don't understand why you're telling me this," Tanya said, her voice carrying a note of suspicion. "Or what it has to do with our housing situation." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense and focused. "Meridian Development Group is the company that purchased your building," she said quietly. "We're the ones who issued the eviction notices." Tanya felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her, and she set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. The woman she had helped, the person who had seemed so genuinely grateful for her kindness, was directly responsible for the crisis that was threatening to destroy her family's stability. "I don't understand," Tanya whispered, though part of her was beginning to grasp the full implications of Victoria's revelation. "Let me explain our company's approach to development projects," Victoria said, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism despite the obvious impact her words were having on Tanya. "When we acquire buildings for renovation, we conduct extensive community assessments to understand the social dynamics and resident quality in each location." Tanya listened in stunned silence as Victoria outlined a process that seemed to reduce her neighbors and community to data points in a business analysis. "Most development companies simply clear out existing tenants and renovate for maximum profit," Victoria continued. "But Meridian takes a different approach. We believe that strong communities have value that goes beyond rental income, and we look for ways to preserve that value while improving living conditions and property values." "So you trick people into helping you so you can decide whether they deserve to keep their homes?" Tanya asked, her voice rising with anger and disbelief. "I understand why this feels deceptive," Victoria said, her tone remaining calm despite Tanya's obvious distress. "But the alternative is to make decisions about people's lives based purely on financial data and property assessments, without understanding anything about their character or community contributions." Tanya stood up abruptly and began pacing around the small living room, her mind racing with anger and confusion about everything she was hearing. "You're going to throw us out of our homes no matter what," she said. "What difference does it make whether you think we're good people or not?" "It makes all the difference in the world," Victoria replied firmly. "Tanya, sit down and let me tell you what I'm actually proposing." Something in Victoria's tone made Tanya pause her pacing and reluctantly return to her chair, though she remained tense and ready to ask Victoria to leave at any moment. "Based on my assessment of this community and your role within it, Meridian Development Group would like to offer you and your family a renovated apartment in this building, rent-free for the first 2 years, followed by below-market rent for the subsequent 3 years. Victoria said, "We want to keep families like yours in the neighborhood while we improve the building's infrastructure and common areas." Tanya stared at Victoria in complete disbelief, certain that she had misunderstood something fundamental about the offer being presented. "Rent-free?" she repeated. "For 2 years? Your unit would be completely renovated with new appliances, updated electrical and plumbing systems, and modern fixtures while maintaining the character and layout that works for your family," Victoria continued. "Maya and Sophia would be able to stay in the same school. You'd maintain all your community connections. And you'd have the stability of knowing that your housing costs are covered while you build savings or pursue additional education or career opportunities." The offer seemed too extraordinary to be real, and Tanya found herself searching for the catch or condition that would make it impossible to accept. "Why would you do this?" she asked, What do you get out of offering free housing to people you barely know?" Victoria's expression softened, and for the first time since entering the apartment, she looked more like the vulnerable person Tanya had helped 3 weeks earlier. "Because what you showed me that morning reminded me of why I got into development work in the first place," she said. "I started this company because I wanted to create housing that strengthened communities rather than displacing them. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the human element that makes neighborhoods more than just collections of buildings." Victoria paused to take a sip of her coffee before continuing with her explanation. "Your willingness to help a stranger, to go out of your way for someone you'd never see again, demonstrated exactly the kind of community spirit that makes neighborhoods valuable," she said. "You showed me that this building contains people who look out for each other, who prioritize kindness over convenience, and who create the social connections that turn housing into homes." Tanya felt her anger beginning to fade as she listened to Victoria's explanation, though she remained skeptical about accepting such an extraordinary offer. "What about our neighbors?" she asked. "Rosa and the other families who received eviction notices, what happens to them?" "We're prepared to make similar offers to every family in the building who demonstrates community engagement and wants to remain in the neighborhood," Victoria replied. "Our assessment showed that this building has an unusually strong social fabric, and we want to preserve that while improving the physical infrastructure." The scope of Victoria's proposal was almost impossible for Tanya to process. The idea that her simple act of helping a lost tourist could lead to housing security for her family and her neighbors seemed like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. "I need to understand something," Tanya said, leaning forward in her chair. "When you were standing at that subway map 3 weeks ago, were you really confused about how to get to Columbus Circle, or was that part of your act?" Victoria smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of emotion she had shown since revealing her true identity. "I actually was genuinely confused," she admitted. "I had done my research about the neighborhood and planned my route, but when I got to the station that morning, I realized I had forgotten to account for construction delays that were affecting several train lines. I was standing there trying to figure out alternative routes when you approached me." This admission somehow made Tanya feel better about their initial interaction, knowing that at least some of Victoria's vulnerability had been real rather than manufactured for the assessment. "So my help was actually needed, not just a test of my character?" Tanya asked. "Your help was absolutely needed," Victoria confirmed. "But more than that, the way you provided that help, the genuine concern you showed for a stranger's well-being, told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person you are and the kind of community this building represents." They sat in silence for several minutes as Tanya tried to absorb everything she had learned about Victoria's identity and the extraordinary offer being presented to her family. The apartment around them, which had felt so threatened and temporary just hours earlier, now held the possibility of becoming their secure long-term home. "This is a lot to process," Tanya finally said. "I need time to think about everything you've told me, and I need to discuss this with Maya and Sophia before making any decisions that affect their future." "Of course," Victoria replied, reaching into her purse to pull out a folder of documents. "These papers outline the specific terms of our offer, including the renovation timeline, the rent structure for years 3 through 5, and the community development initiatives we're planning for the building and neighborhood." Tanya accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately, still feeling overwhelmed by the dramatic turn their conversation had taken. "There's one more thing I want you to know," Victoria said as she prepared to leave. "What you did for me that morning wasn't just about giving directions or helping someone navigate the subway system. You treated me with dignity and respect when I was vulnerable and confused. You saw someone who needed help and you provided it without asking for anything in return." Victoria stood up and moved toward the apartment door, but turned back to face Tanya before leaving. "That's the kind of character that builds strong communities," she said. "And it's the kind of character that Meridian Development wants to support and preserve as we improve neighborhoods throughout the city." After Victoria left, Tanya sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the folder of documents and trying to process the evening's revelations. The woman she had helped find her way to Columbus Circle had turned out to be the person responsible for threatening her family's housing security, but also the person offering them an unprecedented opportunity for stability and community preservation. She opened the folder and began reading through the detailed proposal, which outlined not just the specifics of their family's housing arrangement, but also plans for upgrading the building's common areas, creating community programming space, and supporting small businesses in the CAI neighborhood. The scope of Meridian's community development vision was far more comprehensive than anything Tanya had imagined possible. The documents included architectural renderings of the proposed apartment renovations, showing modern kitchens and bathrooms while preserving the character and layout of their current home. There were also plans for a community garden on the building's roof, upgraded laundry facilities in the basement, and a resident meeting space that could be used for children's activities and neighborhood gatherings. As she studied the papers, Tanya found herself thinking about Rosa and their other neighbors, wondering how they would react to learning that their housing crisis might actually lead to improved living conditions and community resources. The transformation seemed almost too good to be true, yet the detailed nature of the proposal suggested that Victoria's offer was genuine and well-planned. She set the documents aside and prepared for bed, knowing that she needed time to process everything before having conversations with Maya and Sophia about their potential future in the renovated building. As she settled onto the fold-out couch, Tanya reflected on the unexpected ways that small acts of kindness could ripple through people's lives, creating connections and opportunities that seemed impossible to predict. Plan. The next morning, Tanya woke up wondering if the previous evening's conversation with Victoria had been an elaborate dream brought on by stress about their housing situation. But the folder of documents on her kitchen table confirmed that everything had actually happened, and that her family's future had potentially been transformed by her decision to help a confused stranger 3 weeks earlier. Maya and Sophia noticed their mother's unusually cheerful demeanor during breakfast and asked several questions about her improved mood. Tanya found herself smiling more genuinely than she had in weeks as she prepared their morning routine, though she decided to wait until she had more information before sharing the details of Victoria's offer. "Mom, you seem really happy today," Sophia observed as she finished her cereal. "Did something good happen?" "I think something very good might be happening," Tanya replied, giving her younger daughter an extra hug. "But I need to have some grown-up conversations first before I can tell you all about it." The cleaning shift at Morrison Financial Tower felt different that morning, as Tanya found herself working with renewed energy and focus, despite having gotten little sleep. Mrs. Chen noticed the improvement in her attitude and performance, commenting that she seemed to have resolved whatever personal issues had been affecting her work. "You're back to your usual standard today, Rodriguez," Mrs. Chen said during their mid-morning break. "I'm glad to see that you found a way to manage your housing situation." "I think I have," Tanya replied, though she was still cautious about counting on Victoria's offer until all the details were finalized. "Thank you for being patient with me while I worked through some difficult circumstances." During her lunch break, Tanya called Victoria's office number to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss the proposal in more detail. She had prepared a list of questions about the renovation timeline, the process for involving other building residents, and the long-term sustainability of Meridian's community development approach. Victoria's assistant scheduled a meeting for the following evening, and Victoria personally came on the line to confirm that Tanya had received all the necessary documentation and to ask if she had any immediate concerns about the proposal. "I'm still processing everything," Tanya admitted. "This is such a dramatic change from what I expected when you called yesterday. I want to make sure I understand all the implications before involving my daughters or getting their hopes up about something that might not work out." "I completely understand your caution," Victoria replied. "This is a significant commitment from both sides, and you should take all the time you need to evaluate whether it's the right decision for your family," The afternoon shift at the dry cleaner provided an opportunity for Tanya to think through the practical aspects of Victoria's offer. The 2-year period of free rent would allow her to build substantial savings, potentially reducing her need for multiple jobs and giving her more time to spend with Maya and Sophia. The below-market rent for the subsequent 3 years would provide continued stability while ensuring that their housing costs remained manageable relative to her income. Mrs. Patterson came in during the afternoon to drop off some items for cleaning, and she immediately noticed Tanya's improved spirits. "You look much more optimistic than you did a few days ago, dear," she observed. "I hope that means your housing situation is working out favorably." "I think it might be," Tanya replied, though she remained careful not to share specific details until everything was confirmed. "Sometimes solutions come from the most unexpected directions." "The best opportunities often do," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "Life has a way of rewarding people who treat others with kindness and respect, even when it takes some time for that reward to become apparent." Her words reminded Tanya of Victoria's explanation about character-building strong communities, and she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led from helping a lost tourist to potentially securing long-term housing stability for her family. The evening shift at the diner was busier than usual, but Tanya found herself serving customers with renewed enthusiasm and patience. Several regular customers commented on her improved mood, and her tips for the evening were higher than average, perhaps reflecting the positive energy she was projecting. As she walked home after midnight, Tanya felt a sense of anticipation about the future that she hadn't experienced in years. The grinding anxiety about making ends meet and providing stability for her daughters had been replaced by the possibility of genuine security and community involvement. She climbed the stairs to their apartment quietly, but found Rosa waiting in the hallway with an expression of curiosity and concern. "Mija, Mrs. Gonzalez told me she saw you talking to a well-dressed woman outside the building last night," Rosa said. She was wondering if it had something to do with our eviction notices. Tanya realized that she would need to share information about Victoria's offer with Rosa and their other neighbors, both to keep the community informed and to understand how the broader proposal might affect everyone in the Pare building. "Actually, it has everything to do with our eviction notices," Tanya said, "but in a way that might be much better than any of us expected. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" They sat together on the stairs between their floors as Tanya explained Victoria's identity, her community assessment process, and the offer to provide renovated apartments for families who wanted to remain in the Purpur building. Rosa listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to amazement as the scope of the proposal became clear. "You're telling me that this woman bought our building specifically to kick us out, but then decided to let us stay because you helped her read a subway map?" Rosa asked. "It's more complicated than that," Tanya replied. "She bought the building to renovate it, and she was testing whether the community here was worth preserving as part of that renovation. My interaction with her convinced her that it was." Rosa shook her head in disbelief, but seemed to be processing the possibility that their housing crisis might actually lead to improved living conditions. "What about the other families?" she asked. "Did she say anything about whether everyone would be eligible for these renovated apartments?" "She said they're prepared to make similar offers to every family that demonstrates community engagement and wants to stay," Tanya replied. "I think that would include pretty much everyone in our building." They talked for another half hour about the implications of Victoria's proposal and the questions that would need to be answered before the community could make informed decisions about their future. Rosa agreed to help Tanya organize a building meeting where Victoria could present the offer to all the residents and answer their questions directly. As Tanya finally entered her own apartment and prepared for bed, she felt grateful for Rosa's friendship and community leadership. The older woman's wisdom and experience would be invaluable in helping their neighbors evaluate Victoria's offer and to make decisions that served the best interests of their families and community. She set her alarm for the usual early hour, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of juggling her multiple jobs. while also managing the complex process of potentially transforming their housing situation. But for the first time in weeks, Tanya fell asleep without anxiety about their future, replaced instead by cautious optimism about possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The next evening's meeting with Victoria took place in the conference room of Meridian Development Group's offices, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city skyline. Tanya felt slightly intimidated by the corporate environment, but Victoria's warm greeting and offer of coffee helped her relax as they settled down to discuss the details of the proposal. "I've had a chance to review all the documents you provided," Tanya said, pulling out the folder along with her list of questions. "I'm impressed by the scope of your community development vision, but I have some concerns about the practical implementation and long-term sustainability of the program." Victoria nodded approvingly at Tanya's thoughtful approach to evaluating the offer. "I'm glad you're asking detailed questions," she said. "This is a significant commitment from both sides, and you should understand exactly what you're agreeing to before making any decisions." They spent the next hour going through Tanya's questions about renovation timelines, temporary housing during construction, community input on design decisions, and the process for resolving any disputes that might arise during the implementation phase. Victoria's answers demonstrated both thorough planning and genuine commitment to resident involvement in all aspects of the development process. "One of my biggest concerns is what happens to families who can't afford the below-market rent after the 2-year free period ends," Tanya said. "I don't want to see people get comfortable in renovated apartments only to face displacement again when the financial assistance ends." "That's exactly the kind of long-term thinking that convinced me you should be involved in the community leadership aspects of this project," Victoria replied. "We're prepared to work with residents on individual financial planning to ensure that the transition to paying rent is manageable for every family." Victoria went on to explain that Meridian had partnerships with job training programs, educational institutions, and financial counseling services that could help residents build career advancement and financial stability during the 2-year free rent period. "The goal isn't just to provide temporary housing assistance," she said. "It's to create sustainable community wealth that ensures long-term stability for families like yours." As their meeting concluded, Victoria presented Tanya with an additional proposal that she hadn't expected. "I'd like to offer you a position as Community Development Coordinator for this project," Victoria said. "Your role would be to serve as a liaison between Meridian and the building residents, help organize community programming, and ensure that our development process serves the actual needs and priorities of the families who live there." The job offer came with a salary that was more than Tanya currently made from all 3 of her existing positions combined, along with health insurance and other benefits that would provide security for her family in ways she had never thought possible. "I don't have any formal experience in community development," Tanya said, though she felt a surge of excitement at the possibility of meaningful work that aligned with her values and experience. "You have something more valuable than formal credentials," Victoria replied. "You have authentic relationships with the community members we're trying to serve, and you understand their needs and priorities from personal experience. Those qualifications are more important than any degree or certification." Victoria explained that the position would involve coordinating with residents during the renovation process, organizing community meetings and feedback sessions, connecting families with supportive services, and helping to develop programming for the new community spaces that would be created in the building. "You'd also be involved in expanding this model to other buildings and neighborhoods," Victoria said. "This project is a pilot program for an approach we want to implement throughout the city, and your experience here would position you to lead similar initiatives in other communities." The scope of the opportunity felt almost overwhelming to Tanya, who had spent years focused on simply surviving day to day rather than imagining long-term career advancement or community leadership roles. "I need to discuss this with Maya and Sophia before making any commitments," she said. "This would change not just our housing situation but our entire family dynamic and future plans." Of course, Victoria agreed. Take all the time you need to consider both the housing offer and the job opportunity. I'm confident that whatever decision you make will be thoughtful and in the best interests of your family. As Tanya left Victoria's office and made her way home, she found herself thinking about the dramatic transformation that her life might undergo in the coming months. The grinding routine of multiple low-wage jobs could be replaced by meaningful work that allowed her to support her community while providing financial stability for her daughters. The conversation with Maya and Sophia that evening proved to be one of the most important discussions they had ever had as a family. Tanya explained Victoria's offer in terms that her daughters could understand, emphasizing both the opportunities and the responsibilities that would come with accepting such a significant arrangement. So we get to stay in our apartment, but it will be like a brand new apartment with better everything? Sophia asked, her 8-year-old mind focusing on the most immediate and tangible aspects of the proposal. And you would have a job helping our neighbors instead of cleaning offices and working at the diner? Maya added, demonstrating her 12-year-old ability to grasp the broader implications of the changes being proposed. That's right, Tanya confirmed. But it also means that we would have responsibilities to our community and to the company that's providing these opportunities. We need to be good neighbors and good representatives of what this kind of development can accomplish. Maya asked thoughtful questions about how the changes might affect their relationships with Rosa and their other neighbors, while Sophia wanted to know if she could help with the community garden that was planned for the building's roof. Their enthusiasm and maturity in discussing the proposal helped Tanya feel more confident about moving forward with Victoria's offer. Her daughters had developed strong connections to their neighborhood and community, and the prospect of maintaining those relationships while improving their living conditions clearly appealed to both of them. I think we should say yes, Mom, Maya said after they had discussed all aspects of the proposal. You always tell us that when someone offers to help, we should accept it gracefully and look for ways to help them in return. This seems like that kind of situation. The next morning, Tanya called Victoria's office to schedule a meeting for signing the agreement and beginning the process of coordinating with other building residents. She also gave notice to her supervisors at all 3 of her current jobs, explaining that she had accepted a position that would allow her to focus on community development work. Mrs. Chen seemed genuinely pleased to learn about Tanya's new opportunity, despite the short notice for finding a replacement cleaner. You've always been one of our most reliable employees, she said. I'm happy to serve as a reference if you ever need one, and I hope this new position provides the stability and advancement opportunities you deserve. The manager at the dry cleaner and the owner of the diner expressed similar support for Tanya's career transition, with both offering to provide positive references and expressing confidence that she would succeed in her new role. The building meeting that Rosa helped organize took place the following Sunday afternoon in the small community room in the basement of their building. Nearly every family in the building attended, creating a packed room filled with the kind of nervous energy that comes when people are facing significant decisions about their future. Victoria arrived with several members of her development team, including architects, community programmers, and financial counselors who could answer specific questions about different aspects of the renovation. Community development process. I want to start by acknowledging that this situation began with eviction notices that caused real fear and stress for all of you, Victoria said as she opened the meeting. I take responsibility for the anxiety that our initial approach created, and I want to ensure that moving forward, this process is transparent and collaborative. She went on to explain Meridian's community development philosophy and the specific plans for their building, including detailed timelines, resident input processes, and support services that would be available. Throughout the renovation period, the questions from residents covered everything from practical concerns about temporary housing during construction to broader issues about gentrification and community preservation. Victoria and her team answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating both technical expertise and genuine commitment to maintaining the character and social fabric of the neighborhood. Rosa asked pointed questions about long-term affordability and community control over decision-making, while other residents wanted to understand the job opportunities and educational programs that would be available through Meridian's partnerships with local organizations. What guarantees do we have that this won't just be a temporary improvement before you sell the building to someone else who will raise the rents or convert to luxury condos? Asked Mr. Petrov, an elderly man who had lived in the building for over a decade. Victoria's response demonstrated understanding of residents' historical experiences with development projects that promised community benefits but ultimately led to displacement. Meridian Development Group is structured as a benefit corporation, which means we're legally required to balance profit with social and environmental impact, she explained. Additionally, we're prepared to establish a community land trust structure that would give residents ownership stake in the building and control over future development decisions. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours as residents asked questions, discussed concerns among themselves, and began to envision what their community might look like after the proposed improvements. By the end of the session, there was clear enthusiasm for moving forward with the project, though several families requested additional time to review the detailed proposals before making final commitments. Over the following weeks, Tanya began her transition into the Community Development Coordinator role, while also helping other residents navigate the decision-making process about their housing arrangements. Her work involved organizing smaller discussion groups, connecting families with financial counseling services, and serving as a communication bridge between the community and Meridian's development team. The experience of helping her neighbors understand and evaluate Victoria's proposal reminded Tanya of the satisfaction she had felt when helping Victoria navigate the subway system, but amplified across an entire community of people she cared about. Each family's decision to accept or decline the renovation offer was complex and personal, but Tanya's role was to ensure that everyone had access to complete information and supportive resources for making their choices. Most families ultimately decided to accept Meridian's offer and remain in the building during and after the renovation process. A few chose to relocate to other neighborhoods where they had family connections or job opportunities, and Victoria's team helped those families find suitable housing options and provided moving assistance. The renovation process began 4 months after the initial eviction notices had been served, with families temporarily relocated to comparable apartments in nearby buildings while their units were being upgraded. Tanya and her daughters stayed in a furnished apartment 6 blocks away, close enough to maintain their community connections while experiencing the strange luxury of living in recently renovated space with modern appliances and efficient heating systems. Maya and Sophia adapted quickly to their temporary housing, though they looked forward to returning to their familiar building with their neighbors and friends. The renovation process became a source of excitement rather than anxiety, as they watched their community being transformed into something that preserved its character while dramatically improving the living conditions for all residents. Tanya's work during this period involved coordinating between residents and contractors, organizing community meetings to address concerns that arose during construction, and beginning to develop programming for the new community spaces that were being created in the building. The roof garden became a particular focus of community enthusiasm, with residents contributing ideas for plant selections, seating areas, and children's play spaces that would make the rooftop a valuable extension of their indoor living areas. Sophia's excitement about helping with the garden motivated other children in the building to become involved in the planning process, creating intergenerational collaboration around the shared outdoor space. 6 months after construction began, Tanya and her daughters were able to move back into their renovated apartment, which had been transformed while maintaining the layout and character features that had made it feel like home. The new kitchen featured energy-efficient appliances and additional storage space, while the bathroom had been completely updated with modern fixtures and improved accessibility features. But the most striking change was in the building's common areas, which now included a community meeting room with flexible furniture for different types of gatherings. upgraded laundry facilities with efficient machines and comfortable seating areas, and the rooftop garden that had become a source of pride and daily enjoyment for residents of all ages. The first community dinner held in the renovated meeting room brought together families who had been neighbors for years but had never had adequate space for large group gatherings. The evening featured potluck dishes that reflected the cultural diversity of the building's residents, along with presentations about upcoming programming and opportunities for community involvement in neighborhood improvement initiatives. Victoria attended the dinner as a guest rather than as the developer, and Tanya watched her interact with residents who now knew her as someone who had kept her promises about community preservation and improvement. The trust that had been built through the renovation process was evident in the comfortable conversations and collaborative planning that filled the evening. "You were right about the character of this community," Tanya told Victoria as they stood on the rooftop garden looking out over the neighborhood. "What you saw during your assessment that morning was just the beginning of what people here are capable of when they have stable housing and supportive resources." Victoria nodded, her expression reflecting satisfaction with the project's outcomes and anticipation about expanding the model to other communities. "Your role in making this successful can't be overstated," she replied. Having someone who understood both the community's needs and the development process was essential for building the trust and collaboration that made everything work. As fall turned to winter, Tanya settled into the rhythm of her new role with growing confidence and effectiveness. Her work had expanded to include consultation on 3 other buildings that Meridian was considering for similar community development projects. And she'd begun taking evening classes in urban planning to deepen her understanding of housing policy and community development theory. Maya and Sophia thrived in their renovated apartment and strengthened community, with Maya taking on leadership responsibilities in the building's youth programming and Sophia becoming the unofficial assistant garden coordinator for the rooftop space. Both girls had maintained their academic performance while also developing new interests and skills through the community programming that Tanya helped coordinate. The transformation of their building had attracted attention from other neighborhoods facing similar pressures from development and gentrification. And Tanya found herself speaking at community meetings and policy forums about the importance of resident involvement in development decisions. The key insight from our experience, she would tell these audiences, is that community members aren't obstacles to development. They're the most valuable resource for creating developments that actually improve neighborhoods rather than destroying them. 1 year after Victoria had knocked on her door to serve an eviction notice, Tanya received a different kind of unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patterson from the dry cleaner had tracked down her new address and stopped by to see how she was doing in her changed circumstances. "I always knew you were destined for something more significant than pressing clothes and cleaning offices," the elderly woman said as Tanya gave her a tour of the renovated building. "You have the kind of character that recognizes opportunities to help others, and eventually those opportunities find ways to help you in return." Mrs. Patterson's visit reminded Tanya of all the people throughout her journey who had provided support, encouragement, and small kindnesses that had sustained her during difficult periods. Rosa's ongoing friendship and childcare support, Mr. Kim's recommendation that had led to potential housing options, the various customers and colleagues who had treated her with respect and dignity despite her Tao. Economic circumstances. I've learned that community is built through thousands of small interactions where people choose to see each other's humanity rather than just their economic status or immediate usefulness. Tanya reflected, as she and Mrs. Patterson sat in the rooftop garden watching Sophia water the tomato plants. The success of their building's transformation had led to Tanya's promotion to Regional Community Development Director, with responsibility for overseeing similar projects throughout the city. Her work now involved training other community coordinators, developing policy recommendations for municipal housing authorities, and consulting with developers who wanted to implement community preserving renovation approaches. Maya had begun high school with strong academic performance and clear aspirations for college and career paths that would allow her to continue her mother's work in community development and social justice. Sophia's involvement in the rooftop garden had sparked an interest in environmental science and urban agriculture that influenced her academic choices and extracurricular activities. 2 years after the renovation process began, Tanya stood once again on the subway platform where she had first encountered Victoria. Though now she was heading to a conference where she would present their community development model to housing advocates from across the country. As she waited for her train, she thought about the unpredictable ways that small acts of kindness could ripple through people's lives, creating opportunities and connections that seemed impossible to plan or predict. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria, who was attending the same conference to discuss Meridian's expansion of community-centered development practices to other cities. "Looking forward to your presentation today," the message read. "Thank you for continuing to remind me that the best development projects are built on relationships rather than just real estate." As Tanya boarded the train that would take her to the conference, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from struggling to balance 3 jobs while raising her daughters in an uncertain housing situation to leading community development initiatives that were creating opportunities for families throughout the city. The subway map that had once seemed so confusing to Victoria now felt familiar and navigable to Tanya. Not just in terms of transit routes, but as a metaphor for the ways that people could help each other find their way through life's complicated journeys. Her willingness to pause her own hurried morning routine to help a confused stranger had led to discovering that sometimes the people who seem to need our help the most are actually in positions to provide the assistance we didn't even know we needed. The conference presentation went well, with audience members asking thoughtful questions about replicating their community development model in different geographic and economic contexts. Several cities expressed interest in partnering with Meridian to pilot similar projects, and Tanya found herself consulting on initiatives that would potentially provide stable, community-centered housing for thousands of families facing displacement pressures. During the lunch break, Victoria joined Tanya at a table overlooking the conference center's urban garden, and they discussed the evolution of their working relationship from that initial subway encounter to their current collaboration on expanding community development practices. "I've been thinking about what made our project successful, when so many similar initiatives failed to achieve their community preservation goals," Victoria said as they watched conference attendees networking in the subways. "Garden space. I think it comes down to whether developers are willing to recognize that existing communities have value that goes beyond their economic productivity," Tanya replied. "Most development projects treat residents as obstacles to be cleared away rather than assets to be supported and strengthened." Victoria nodded, then smiled as she remembered something from their early interactions. "You know, I've been conducting community assessments for 5 years. And you're the only person who ever went multiple blocks out of your way to make sure I reached my destination safely," she said. "Most people give directions and wish you luck, but you actually invested your time and attention to ensure that a stranger's day went well." "I just remembered what it felt like to be lost and confused in the city," Tanya replied. "Someone helped me during my first week here, and I always promised myself I'd pay that forward when I had the chance." Their conversation was interrupted by a conference organizer who wanted to introduce Tanya to representatives from several cities that were interested in implementing similar community development approaches. As she stood up to join the networking group, Tanya felt grateful for the unexpected path that had brought her to this work and the partnerships that were allowing their local success to influence housing policy at a much larger scale. The remainder of the conference provided opportunities for Tanya to connect with community advocates, policy researchers, and residents from other cities who were facing similar challenges related to housing, stability, and neighborhood preservation. Each conversation reinforced her understanding that their experience in Queens was part of a much larger national conversation about how development could strengthen rather than displace existing communities. 6 months later, Tanya was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee that was considering federal legislation to support community-centered development approaches. Her testimony drew on both her personal experience of housing insecurity and her professional work in community development. Argue for policies that would incentivize developers to preserve and strengthen existing communities rather than displacing them. Housing stability isn't just about having a roof over your head, she told the subcommittee members. It's about being part of a community where people know your children's names, where neighbors look out for each other during emergencies, and where residents have input into decisions that affect their daily lives. The legislation ultimately passed with bipartisan support, creating federal funding streams for community development projects that demonstrated meaningful resident involvement and measurable outcomes in terms of both housing quality and community preservation. Maya had begun her senior year of high school with clear plans to study urban planning and public policy in college, inspired by watching her mother's career development and the community transformation she had helped facilitate. Sophia, now in middle school, had become a youth advocate for urban agriculture and environmental justice, using the rooftop garden as a model for presentations she gave to other schools about sustainable community development. 5 years after receiving that initial eviction notice, Tanya stood once again in their renovated apartment, but now she was hosting a celebration for the 5th community development project that had been completed using their building as a model. Representatives from all 5 communities were present, along with policymakers, foundation funders, and media representatives who were documenting the success of community-centered development approaches. Victoria had traveled from Seattle, where Meridian had opened a second office to manage their expanding portfolio of community development projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her company had become a national leader in development practices that prioritized community preservation and resident empowerment, attracting investment from foundations and government agencies that supported innovative approaches to affordable housing. None of this would have been possible without Tanya's willingness to see me as a person who needed help, rather than just another tourist taking up space on the subway platform, Victoria told the celebration gathering. Her simple act of kindness opened my eyes to the value of authentic community connections, and it reminded me that the best development projects are built on relationships rather than just real estate transactions. As the evening progressed, residents from all 5 buildings shared stories about how community-centered development had affected their families, their neighborhoods, and their aspirations for the future. Children who had been involved in planning community gardens and programming spaces spoke about their interests in environmental science and community organizing. Parents described career advancement opportunities that had become possible once they had stable housing and community support systems. Rosa, now in her 70s but still actively involved in building leadership, spoke about the importance of intergenerational collaboration in creating communities that served residents across different life stages and circumstances. What we learned through this process is that when people have security and support, they become resources for each other rather than competitors for scarce opportunities, she told the gathering. Community development isn't just about improving buildings. It's about strengthening the relationships that make neighborhoods into homes. The celebration concluded with presentations about upcoming projects in 3 additional cities, along with announcements about federal funding that would support expanding community-centered development approaches to rural areas and smaller cities that face different but related challenges around housing, stability, and community preservation. As guests began to leave, Tanya found herself alone with Victoria on the rooftop garden. Looking out over a neighborhood that had been transformed not just through physical improvements, but through strengthened relationships and increased opportunities for resident leadership and economic advancement. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had been too rushed that morning to stop and help me? Victoria asked as they watched the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of orange and pink. I think about it sometimes, Tanya replied. But I also think about all the other moments when people choose whether to help each other or just focus on their own immediate concerns. This whole experience has taught me that we're constantly creating opportunities for connection and mutual support, even when we don't realize it. Victoria nodded, then shared something she had never told Tanya before. That morning when you helped me, I was actually having doubts about whether community-centered development was realistic or just an idealistic concept that wouldn't work in practice, she said. Your willingness to go out of your way for a stranger convinced me that the kind of community spirit we were trying to preserve actually existed and was worth the investment. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching as lights began to appear in windows throughout the neighborhood. The building below them buzzed with the sounds of families having dinner, children playing in the common areas, and neighbors gathering for informal conversations in the upgraded lobby space. Tanya's phone buzzed with a text message from Maya, who was now in her first year of college but maintained close connections to the community that had shaped her childhood. Saw your interview about the new federal funding on the news tonight, the message read. So proud of everything you've accomplished and excited to join you in this work after graduation. As Tanya and Victoria made their way back downstairs, they passed families gathering for the weekly community meeting where residents discussed building maintenance issues, planned neighborhood improvement projects, and coordinated support for community members facing various challenges. The scene reminded Tanya of her original hopes for what community could provide for her family when she had first moved to the city. Searching for affordability, but also for the kind of social connections that would help Maya and Sophia thrive despite their economic circumstances. The most important thing we learned, Tanya reflected as she and Victoria reached the lobby, is that community development isn't something that happens to residents. It's something that happens with residents when they have the stability and resources to invest in each other's success. Victoria agreed, then shared her plans for a new initiative that would train community members from successful projects to serve as consultants for communities just beginning similar development processes. Your expertise in building trust between developers and residents is exactly what other communities need to make these projects successful, she said. Would you be interested in developing a national training program that could help replicate not just our development model, but also the community engagement approaches that made it work? The opportunity represented another unexpected expansion of the path that had begun with helping a confused tourist navigate the subway system. But Tanya felt ready for the challenge of supporting community development initiatives at an even larger scale. As she climbed the stairs to her renovated apartment, where Sophia was waiting to share details about her day at school and her latest ideas for expanding the rooftop garden, Tanya reflected on the unpredictable ways that simple acts of human kindness could create ripple effects that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities and policy systems. The fold-out couch that had once served as her bed was now a comfortable seating area where she and her daughters gathered each evening to discuss their days, plan weekend activities, and dream about their future contributions to community development and social justice work. 8 years after their initial subway encounter, Tanya received an invitation that surprised even her. Victoria had been selected to receive a national award for innovative community development practices, and she had requested that Tanya introduce her at the ceremony. I can't accept recognition for this work without acknowledging that it all began with your willingness to see me as a person who needed help, Victoria had written in her invitation letter. Your introduction would be a reminder to everyone in our field that the best development projects are built on relationships rather than just capital and construction. The award ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., with an audience that included community development practitioners, federal policymakers, foundation leaders, and residents from communities where similar projects had been implemented. Tanya's introduction focused on the importance of authentic community engagement and the ways that small acts of kindness could create unexpected opportunities for collaboration and mutual support. 8 years ago, I was running late for work when I saw someone who needed help navigating our city, she told the audience. I had no idea that taking a few extra minutes to ensure that stranger reached her destination safely would lead to transforming not just my family's housing situation, but our entire approach to my community development. Victoria's acceptance speech emphasized the lessons she had learned about the value of existing communities and the importance of development practices that strengthened rather than displaced the social networks that helped our families thrive. Community development isn't about building better apartments, she said. It's about creating conditions where people can build better lives together, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each other's successes. The ceremony concluded with announcements about federal funding for community development initiatives in 50 cities across the country, along with the establishment of a national training institute that would be directed by Tanya and focused on community engagement approaches that had proven successful in preserving and strengthening neighborhoods facing development pressure. Maya, now a recent college graduate with a degree in urban planning, had been hired as the Training Institute's first program coordinator, bringing the family's involvement in community development work full circle, from personal experience to professional expertise spanning 2 generations. Sophia, finishing her junior year of high school, had been accepted to a summer internship program with the Environmental Protection Agency, where she would work on urban agriculture initiatives and community-based environmental justice projects. 10 years after Victoria had knocked on their door with an eviction notice, Tanya stood once again in the small apartment that had been transformed multiple times, first through renovation and later through the memories and experiences that had accumulated within its walls. The space now served as both home and informal office for the National Training Institute, with the kitchen table frequently hosting video conferences with community development practitioners from across the country, and the living room serving as a meeting space for local residents who were interested in supporting similar projects in neighboring communities. The building itself had become a pilgrimage site for community developers, policy researchers, and residents from other cities who wanted to understand how community-centered development could work in practice. Tanya regularly conducted tours that highlighted not just the physical improvements, but the social infrastructure that had developed through years of intentional community building and resident leadership. Victoria visited several times a year, maintaining her role as a consultant and friend rather than as the developer who had initiated their community's transformation. Her company had completed community-centered development projects in 43 cities, with each project adapted to local conditions and community priorities while maintaining core principles of CRADE, resident involvement and community preservation. The most important thing we learned is that every community has existing assets and relationships that can be strengthened through supportive development practices, Victoria would tell audiences at conferences and policy forums. The developer's job isn't to create community where none exists. It's to recognize and support the community that's already there. Tanya's work had evolved to include policy advocacy at the federal level, consulting with municipal governments about community development best practices, and training developers who wanted to implement community-centered approaches in their own projects. Her testimony before Congress, her presentations at national conferences, and her writing about community development had established her as a leading voice in conversations about housing policy and neighborhood preservation, but she remained grounded in the daily realities of community life through her continued residence in the building where everything had begun. On quiet evenings, when she sat on the rooftop garden watching Sophia tend to the vegetables that now supplied fresh produce for several families in the building, Tanya often reflected on the chain of events that had connected her decision to help a confused stranger with the transformation of federal housing policy and the improvement of living conditions for thousands of families across the country. The business card that Victoria had given her after their first encounter remained in the small box where Tanya kept important documents and mementos, a reminder of how a simple moment of human kindness had created opportunities neither of them could have imagined when they first stood together, looking at a subway map in the dim lighting of an underground station. Maya had recently announced her engagement to a fellow community development practitioner she had met during graduate school, and they were planning to establish their own consulting firm focused on supporting resident-led development initiatives in rural communities that face different but related challenges around housing and economic development. Sophia had been accepted to early admission at several universities where she planned to study environmental science and public policy, with clear intentions to continue the family's work in community development while focusing specifically on climate resilience and sustainable urban agriculture. The ripple effects of that initial subway encounter continued to expand in ways that none of them could have predicted, creating careers, transforming policies, and improving living conditions for families who would never know that their opportunities had originated with a harried single mother's decision to pause her rushed morning routine to help someone who appeared to need directions. 15 years later, Tanya was invited to deliver the keynote address at a national conference on community development, where she would speak to an audience of practitioners, residents, and policymakers about the lessons learned from decades of community-centered development work. The most important insight from our experience, she planned to tell the audience, is that community development begins with recognition of the inherent dignity and wisdom that exists within every neighborhood, regardless of its economic circumstances or physical condition. As she prepared her presentation in the renovated apartment that had been the starting point for everything that followed, Tanya found herself thinking about the countless small interactions and decisions that had contributed to the transformation of not just their building but their understanding of what development could accomplish when it was guided by relationships rather than just financial calculations. The subway system that had once seemed overwhelming and confusing when she first arrived in the city now felt like a metaphor for the complex networks of support and connection that made urban communities resilient and nurturing places for families to build their lives. Victoria's community assessment had been designed to test whether authentic human kindness still existed among strangers in the city. But it had ultimately revealed that such kindness was not only present, but could serve as the foundation for development practices that strengthened, rather than disrupted, the social fabric that held communities together. The story that had begun with a simple offer to help someone find their way had evolved into a national model for community development that recognized resident leadership as the most valuable resource for creating neighborhoods where families could thrive across generations. As Tanya looked out the window of their transformed apartment at the neighborhood that had been strengthened rather than gentrified through thoughtful development practices, she felt grateful for the unexpected path that had brought her family from housing insecurity to community leadership, and for the reminder that the most important acts of kindness are often the ones that cost us nothing more than a willingness to see each other's humanity and respond with compassion.